so I'm starting the stream right now. So, yeah, so we're live. Everyone say hello.
Hi. I get really nervous when you do this.
Okay, so, so here we go. We're going to be talking about East Asia today. So East Asia, of course, is, it's in Asia. It's the very eastern part. So we're going to go time period by time period through the history of East Asia. And there's going to be a few things we're really focusing on here. Obviously, there's going to be a lot about China because China is literally like 1/6 of the entire world's population at any given moment. So they have a lot of history to deal with. So now we're going to be starting then with units 1 and 2. So up to 600 CE. So up through the classical era. Now, as you can see here, though, if you look at the map of East Asia, so here's India down here. There's Southeast Asia with Vietnam and such. The Himalayas are a major natural barrier between China and India. So there's never been like any, migration or invasion across that barrier because the Himalayas are the tallest mountains in the entire world. So this is a natural barrier, and in order for like goods and ideas and so on to get between these two major civilizations, they go either up through the Silk Road, through Central Asia, or they go down through Southeast Asia, which is one of the other sort of routes. But in China, though, two major river systems, the Yellow River in the north, and then the Yangtze River in kind of like central South China. Now, generally speaking, through most of Chinese history, southern China is where you will have more population for most of Chinese history, because that is where you have the right climate and conditions for rice cultivation. And once again, rice. Rice is like the key to, civilization in this part of the world. So, so let's talk about China then. So the very first civilization in China that is kind of unique and recognizable was Shang civilization. This was along the Yellow River Valley in the northern part of China. And this is where we have the first indication of like big political states and the first writing system in China. And China is kind of unique in how much continuity there is from one moment to the next in their civilization. Now, that's not to say that they're like stagnant and that they never change, but there are a lot of things that were sort of there right at the beginning that are still there. Like the writing system of China now is based on the writing system that developed during Shang civilization 4,000 years ago with, some modifications over time. So it is a very sort of long-lasting and kind of continuous civilization. Now, Shang civilization then gave way to the Zhou Dynasty, Z-H-O-U. So this is also during the first time period, and this was kind of a feudal system, and we didn't really talk about this too much in class because it's so early on. But once again, some of the concepts of Chinese civilization emerged during this time period. So this is when like Ancestor Veneration becomes a really big deal. What is Ancestor Veneration?
Worship like your ancestors.
Yeah, worship, or at least show like great respect for your ancestors. And this also, the Zhou Dynasty was never really that centralized, and within a few hundred years of the Zhou Dynasty emerging, it kind of collapsed into the Warring States era, which really was just kind of like a feudal system, where you had a bunch of small kingdoms across China all vying for power. Now, the Warring States era is when the three big philosophies of classical China emerged: Confucianism, Daoism, Legalism. Legalism is, or was, the idea that the law is the law, and that the basis for a good society is strict adherence to and application of the law, no matter who the person is. So no distinctions between different social classes or like wealth. If you break the law, you get punished. If you do good things for society and you uphold the law, then you get rewarded for it. So, now, the other two big philosophies, though. Daoism was a kind of like, sort of go with the flow kind of thing. And the word Tao itself just means the way of nature, the way of heaven and the universe. and that your role as a human being, in order to promote harmony in society, in the world, in the universe, was to allow nature to take its natural course, to not get in the way or like impose a false order or hierarchy onto nature. So Taoism in Chinese history will always be there. It'll be a popular religion that people just kind of do and apply to their daily lives, rather than an official religion that is like imposed on society from the top down. So, so there will be Taoist temples, Taoist monasteries, where people will go and, you know, just like meditate out in nature. And when you see people doing like Tai Chi in the park or something, that is based in Taoism, the idea of allowing nature and energy to kind of flow naturally. Confucianism was a sort of social and political philosophy that began with Confucius, who lived in the 500s BCE. And his goal was to promote harmony in society and the universe, but rather than like getting out of the way, it was instead understanding that society is, and that the world is made up of a hierarchical ranking system, where some people are more powerful than others, some people rank higher than others or below others. And the key to sort of making society work is to understand where you are in this relationship system, and then fulfilling the obligations you have to those above you and those below you. And if everyone treats each other with mutual respect and consideration and fulfills their obligations, then society will just work properly, and people will be satisfied, and the universe will be pleased. So within Confucianism then, the idea of filial piety is the fundamental idea that the basic sort of unit in society is the family. And the most important relationship there is between the father or the parents and then the generations after them, so their children and grandchildren. And as long as the children have obedience toward and love and respect for the parents and older generations, and as long as the older generations take seriously their, you know, fulfillment of their duties and obligations to teach and instruct the younger generations, then order will be maintained, filial piety will be observed, and society will be good. So, now, and Confucianism also is generally something that advocated and promoted patriarchy as well. And remember, like the whole idea of yin and yang, the sort of balance of opposing complementary forces in the universe, was tied into this idea of harmony. So the idea of yin and yang then was meant to represent complementary forces, which included male and female, active and passive. And men and women within a sort of Confucian worldview were meant to occupy those roles in society. Men as the active ones who lead and control, women as the ones who, you know, support and nurture and sort of take a passive role. So, now, the Zhou dynasty then is also when the mandate of heaven was first conceived of. It's essentially a form of divine right to rule, where the Zhou dynasty, when they established their rule, claimed that the Shang dynasty had become corrupt and no longer had the permission or the mandate of heaven or the gods to rule China, because they had basically become corrupt and given up their moral authority. So instead, the Zhou dynasty claimed that heaven, that the gods in the Chinese pantheon, gave them the right to rule, and that as long as they fulfilled their obligations toward others and toward the people below them, and as long as they ruled China on behalf of the people, then they would maintain the mandate of heaven. And this concept then was used by later dynasties to justify overthrowing previous dynasties, that we are the ones who now have moral authority and have the right to rule over China on behalf of the gods. So now, the big dynasties of this time period then. The Qin dynasty unified China in 220 BCE. They were the first, well, they were one of the kingdoms during the Warring States, and gradually, especially under the leadership of Qin Shi Huangdi, right here, they unified their control over the heartland of China, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River basins. And then once they did that, they began the process of centralizing Chinese society and civilization. And the word China that we use to describe this whole country now is based in the name of this dynasty. So this is viewed as the first dynasty that really unified Chinese civilization in a meaningful way. And they did things like standardizing weights and measures, standardizing the money supply, standardizing the written language and the legal code for all of China, creating the first like centralized bureaucratic system in China where you had government officials sent out by the emperor to go and like conduct government business and collect taxes in every province and village in China. So this was really when like the idea of the dynasties and the empires of a powerful centralized state really emerge. So now Shi Huangdi, though, he applied very strict legalist principles, and he did use forced labor by peasants to start building the Great Wall and the Grand Canal system and the road networks around China. So even though he was doing things that were productive and sort of beneficial, he was doing it in such a heavy-handed way that it led to rebellions. And after his death, a wave of peasant rebellions led to the birth of the Han Dynasty. And the thing is, the Han Dynasty and other dynasties later, they kept on doing a lot of the things the Qin Dynasty did. And frankly, they kept on doing things that every empire in history has done. Building infrastructure, building public works, establishing a centralized government structure and a professional army and a legal system for all of the country. So, but the big difference, though, was that they promoted Confucianism as the sort of ideal and basis for a good government. So they had this, I mean, you could sort of call it propaganda, where they wanted to promote this ideal that, unlike the Qin, who were just like nasty, harsh legalists and authoritarians, the Han were actually the ones who were the sort of virtuous and wise, guardians of society. Even though they quite often used a lot of the same tactics and methods that the Qin Dynasty did. So this is, though, when they start using Confucian philosophy to recruit people into the sort of elite scholar gentry class, who become the new leaders and elites within society. Now, during the Han, though, the birth of the scholar gentry class, that was something that would be constantly used by dynasties later on as well to justify their rule. That the bureaucracy, the people who worked for the government, would be this special elite group who had proven themselves worthy of leadership, whether it was by recommendation or later through the civil service exam system. So even the lowest level tax collector or canal inspector in a little village in the countryside would be someone who was placed there by the central government, who had sort of earned that position, hypothetically, through their merit. Now, there were ways that the system could become corrupted, though, because the people more likely to actually make their way into that level of government were usually from wealthier, powerful families already. And there was this constantly sort of ongoing struggle that is also kind of similar to other empires between the central government that wanted to centralize the state and have more control by the emperor and his guys over the government versus big landowners out in the countryside who could sometimes have their own military systems, their own mercenary forces, and could have sort of independent political power. So there's going to be a constant struggle then between the dynasty, which will quite often engage in land reform to try and break up big estates to give back to peasants, versus the landowners. And also merchants as well are a constant, have this kind of touchy relationship with the dynasty. So part of Confucian philosophy is that merchants, people who buy and sell goods, were looked at as kind of parasitic and not really useful for society. So many of the most important resources in Chinese civilization, so things like salt and iron especially, will quite often be under direct control of the state, even as far back as the Han Dynasty. So this is something that, communist parties thousands of years later are going to do, where you have state control over resources to make sure that it's being like distributed properly and developed. Even back in the Han Dynasty, they did this with some really important resources. So now, the Han Dynasty, they were also the first Chinese dynasty to try and expand along the Silk Road, and they opened up the Silk Road trade with Central Asian nomads, who were the sort of carriers back and forth along the Silk Road. The Chinese exported silk, but then eventually things like jade and porcelain, paper later on, a lot of different types of luxury goods. So, now, in Japan, though, Japan also starts to emerge as well as a unique civilization. The traditional religion of Japan was Shinto, which is an animistic polytheistic religion. So, animistic meaning that natural objects are thought to be inhabited by some divine spirit or essence. So, rocks and trees and the water and mountains. What was the word for the, like, I guess you could say the gods or the spirits in nature in Shinto? Kami. Yeah, Kami. K-A-M-I. So in Shinto, it's sort of like Daoism, and, you know, there's rituals that are performed, and this once again becomes just kind of like the religion that's there in Japan, just in the background of Japanese culture at all times, even when they adopt other religions. It's just the religion that people sort of do when they're in Japan. Now, also then, the Emperor of Japan. I may have mentioned this at some point, but hold on. Let me take care of that.
Why does it do that?
Why does it do that?
The mechanics.
There's a work order in, so it should be fixed tomorrow. Hypothetically. All right, we're back. So, the Emperor of Japan was a sort of religious and political position. And the first emperor in Japanese history sits on the throne sometime in like the 300s or 400s CE. And up to this very day, right now, 2018, it is the same dynasty that has been sitting on the imperial throne of Japan for like 1600 years. Now, even though the emperor didn't really have a lot of political power, even early on, what is like the religious significance of the emperor in Japan? Yeah, he was descended from the sun goddess, or the sun kami in Shinto. So even, like, no matter what else happens in Japanese civilization, the emperor is this kind of religious institution and figurehead of his own, who is a kind of an object of devotion within Japanese culture. So, let's move on, shall we? All right, yes.
Wait, so the Han Dynasty started this college entry?
Yes. Yes. All right. So now, 600 to 1450, Unit 3. A lot of stuff going on here. So rice. Champa rice from Vietnam. Yes. But just rice cultivation really takes off in southern China. And the population of China during this time period absolutely just explodes. And, you know, after the year 1000, there actually were a few hundred years of, you know, just kind of warming temperatures across the whole world, and that facilitated, you know, better agriculture and population growth as well. But rice in southern China becomes like that. That's where it's happening, and that's where the population will get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, this is also when the tributary system really takes shape, where as newer civilizations pop up, you know, and this applies to like the nomadic peoples who live north and west of China, so the steppe nomads like the Xiongnu and the Uyghurs, and eventually the Mongols. They're part of this system, but also Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and some of these islands out here get involved in this as well. This is the system where these non-Chinese civilizations go to China and basically sort of submit, or at least acknowledge, Chinese supremacy and the sort of greatness of Chinese civilization. And in exchange, elites from those civilizations gain access to trade, luxury goods from China. They, go to study at like Chinese Buddhist monasteries or temples or what have you. So there's this kind of exchange. Now, in the civilizations that engage in the tribute system, different people get different things out of it. So the steppe nomads who engage in the tribute system, quite often, because they are kind of like scary to the Chinese, they get just kind of bribed or supported in exchange for just not invading China. And, but elites from places like Korea and Japan and Vietnam, they are able to sort of like learn about Chinese civilization. And then when they go back to like their homeland, they become this kind of like special class of people. So if you're like a Korean elite, a big Korean landowner who goes off to China to like speak to the Chinese emperor and like learn about Chinese culture and start like using their writing system, and then you go back to Korea, you are somehow now kind of different from the rest of society. So it does give some degree of prestige to people who engage in the system. So now, the tribute system then, the Chinese writing system becomes prevalent all across East Asia and is adapted in Korea and Japan to those languages. Buddhism also goes through the Silk Road, through China, and then into the rest of East Asia. So some ideas from Chinese culture go into these other places. So now, during this time period then, in China, the Han Dynasty collapsed right around 200 CE as a result of, internal crisis and disputes combined with like invasions by nomadic peoples. And then after a couple hundred years of disunity, the Sui dynasty briefly reunifies China. But then after a couple of decades, they're replaced by the Tang dynasty. And the Tang dynasty lasts about 300 years, until the 900s. So, a few things about the Tang. This is when you have the rise of Buddhism, specifically Mahayana Buddhism in East Asia. And Mahayana, that's the branch of Buddhism that was more adaptable to like other religious ideas, where there was more syncretism that went on with other religions. So as Buddhism entered into China, it kind of blended with Daoism. And then when it got to Japan, it kind of blended with Shinto. And you see that people in these countries started to do things like worshiping the Buddha as a god or as some kind of spirit. And they kind of, mapped like other Buddhist figures and Buddhist leaders onto like various gods or concepts in the universe. And, the whole sort of like practice of Buddhism, of meditating and being very sort of compassionate and passive, it really kind of fit well with Taoist concepts, to the point where like Buddhist missionaries in China will refer to the way of the Buddha and like the practices of Buddhism as the Tao of the Buddha. So they really sort of use a lot of the same terms to apply to both religions, and that allows Buddhism to become very popular very quickly. And the Tang Dynasty does things like build monasteries, build temples, until eventually in the 800s they turn against it, primarily because they sort of scapegoat it for like other issues, economic problems, military challenges that they're dealing with. But, and they consider it kind of like foreign and weird and barbaric. But even after the Tang Dynasty turns against it, it doesn't go away. It stays in China and remains just part of the religious scenery and background of Chinese culture. So, now this is also when the exam system becomes a super big deal. So once again, people are like doing Confucianism and Daoism and Buddhism kind of all at the same time in China during this time period. So, now, the Tang Dynasty collapses mostly due to like external threats from, once again, the nomads to the north. And then the Song Dynasty replaces them. And the Song, they never really go out along the Silk Road, but they're going to be doing more overseas trade, and merchants will be coming to China in greater and greater numbers, especially to like port cities along southern China, to do business and to export goods from China and import goods to China. So during the Song, the population of China breaks 100 million for the first time. By far, like the biggest, most urbanized, and most commercialized civilization on Earth. And during this time, all sorts of new inventions pop up. So gunpowder's invented and becomes, you know, a big deal as it spreads across Eurasia. Paper, printing technology is invented in East Asia. What was the fourth big invention? The compass, the magnetic compass. And as that spreads, it allows more intensified overseas trade. So the Song Dynasty, the Tang Dynasty, these are really sort of vibrant, dynamic times in Chinese history. And the Song Dynasty are actually the first ones to use paper money rather than metal money as a way of like storing value and facilitating trade. Although they don't quite understand how to like keep the value of paper money under control. So there's like enormous hyperinflation a couple of times as a result. But in any case, though, Song Dynasty is a sort of dynamic place. They invent noodles. They start exporting huge amounts of porcelain, china, jade. They invent like restaurants. They invent like test prep books, you know, to help you study for the Confucian exams. So a lot of cool stuff going on there. Now, the Song Dynasty, though, is conquered in the 1200s by basically like the irresistible force of the 1200s, the Mongols. So Genghis Khan begins the conquest of China, but then it's completed by some of his descendants. And by 1279, the Song Dynasty is gone, and the Yuan Dynasty has begun. That's the name given to this dynasty that is ruled by the Mongols. But the Yuan Dynasty, though, also included Mongolia, the Mongol homeland. So this was an enormous dynasty in terms of landmass. But the capital of this dynasty, though, under Kublai Khan, one of the later Khans of the Mongols, he moved the capital south from Mongolia to Beijing, which is still the capital of China to this day. It was kind of right in the middle of the territory that they controlled. Now the Mongols, while they were in power, you know, they slaughtered lots of people as they were doing this conquest. And they seriously depopulated northern China, and millions of people fled to the south as refugees. So once again, it leads to even more sort of like shifting population toward the south. But the Mongols, though, while they were in power, there weren't that many Mongols, and they adopted some aspects of Chinese rule. So they started using Confucian rituals. You know, they claimed that they had the mandate of heaven. But for the most part, the Mongols themselves were pretty Buddhist, and they kind of flung open the doors of China to foreign merchants, foreign government officials. They actually like imported people from Persia to like help them run their government, you know, professional officials and accountants and so on. And there was this kind of like big shift in the way that Chinese society worked and their attitude toward merchants and like foreigners and so on. So, by the 1360s then, after the Black Death, which spread like wildfire in the 1300s, after the Black Death, that was like a sign to the Chinese that the Mongols had lost the mandate of heaven. So there was a wave of rebellions that overthrew the Mongols in the 1360s. And they were replaced by a new Chinese dynasty, the Ming. And the Ming very quickly tried to just like restore everything great about Chinese civilization. So they, you know, reduced the power of merchants again. They reestablished the exam system as the basis for government. They literally just like threw the Mongols out of the country, any ones that were still left. And in the 1400s, they went on this kind of brief moment of expansion and sort of outward lookingness. So after this moment where China had been like dominated by outsiders and kind of brought low under the Mongols, the Ming Dynasty for like a hot minute are like, hey, China's back, and now we're going to show the world that we're back. So they sent out the voyages under Zheng He, the 7-foot-tall Muslim eunuch from Central Asia, who led this fleet of hundreds of ships all over the Indian Ocean for about like 30 years in the early 1400s. And they weren't trying to conquer. They were just looking for tribute. They were, they settled disputes around the Indian Ocean. They just kind of like flexed their muscles and showed the world, like, this is what China's all about. China is out there. Like the place where you've got all the porcelain from and all the silk, the place where you've heard all these weird stories about. Like, we're real and we're like for real. But in the mid-1400s, the next emperor just decides, you know what, these voyages are a waste of money. We need to defend ourselves from the Mongols in case they come back. We don't need like all this weird foreign influence going on in China. So they cut off the voyages. Zheng He sent, well, he actually had died by that point. The ships are all dismantled, and China becomes kind of like self-contained again, the Middle Kingdom. So now, off in Japan, some more things going on there. This is when Japanese feudalism takes shape, where the emperor has no power, but the people who really gain power are military elites, warriors, kind of like the knights, the lords and vassals of feudal Europe. But here, the warriors are a class of people called samurai. And the leaders of these samurai, like the sort of warlords who actually sort of control the different pieces of Japan, are called daimyos. So daimyos are the leaders, samurai are like the warrior elites who follow them. And collectively, this class of people, they own the land, they fight wars against each other, and the people who work on the land are serfs. They're not slaves, but they're stuck on the land, like working in their village for that particular daimyo or samurai. So, and, different daimyo at different times, like, claim that they're, leading on behalf of the emperor, and that they're doing it to defend the emperor. But the emperor really never has any political power at this point. But Buddhism then also enters Japan. And it entered Japan during the Tang Dynasty, and then became really popular among the samurai, among this warrior elite, and gradually started to like filter down to lower levels in Japanese society as well. But it really began among the elites, the sort of upper levels of Japan, and it coexisted with Shinto in kind of the same way that it did with Daoism in China, where a lot of the concepts, they complement each other. Like, you can go and meditate in a monastery or go pray to the Buddha while also doing Shinto rituals and doing like ritual cleansing ceremonies and so on. So it all sort of fits together. So now, 1450 to 1750, Unit 4. China. So the Ming Dynasty is still chugging along. And this is when they, by the 1600s, or late 1500s, early 1600s, this is when the silver is starting to flow around the world. So historical context, why is the amount of silver in circulation in the world growing in the 1500s? Yes?
Because it's moving from Spain over to China.
Well, not Spain itself.
It's coming from Potosi, right?
Yeah, the Spanish colonies in Mexico, in South America, at the town of Potosi, like the Silver Mountain. And yes, the Spanish are the ones, developing the silver supply and then turning it into currency, and then it enters the circulation of money and trade around the world. So at this point, China was the biggest producer of stuff in the world. Tons of luxury goods that Europeans and others around Asia wanted to get their hands on. So the Ming Dynasty, once they realized how much volume of trade was growing in the 1500s, how much it was expanding, the Ming Dynasty wants to, wet their beak a little bit. So they start demanding that taxes in their country get paid in silver currency to the central government, which they would then use to, build armies, build infrastructure, go off and just do things with it. So this increases the flow of silver into the country, but it also has kind of a destabilizing effect because inflation hits China pretty hard the same way it hit Spain pretty hard. And in the early 1600s, the Little Ice Age happens. So as like the economy of China is already starting to falter a little bit, then you have this couple of decades of global cooling in the early 1600s. So there's crop failures, famines, and all of a sudden, the Ming have lost the mandate of heaven. So the group that takes control after them are the Manchus, a group of nomadic peoples from Manchuria, to the northeast of China right there. And the Manchus, they were sort of like the Mongols. They came from the same lifestyle and background, but unlike the Mongols, they had actually joined the Ming military. So elites from the Manchu peoples basically seized control of the government of China, stabilized the country again, and became the Qing dynasty. So kind of like the Mongols, they tried to do some things in a Chinese way. So they did Confucian rituals. They kept doing the exam system, which the Mongols didn't. But they tried to give the appearance that they were just a regular Chinese dynasty that was ruling China in a Chinese way. But there always was this kind of undercurrent in China that they were looked at as kind of foreigners, as not really true Chinese. And that would come back to, blow up on them later on. Now, during the 1600s, though, this is when, really for the first time, the steppe nomads of Mongolia and Western China along the Silk Road are really going to be brought under Chinese control directly for the first time. Where the Qing military, because now they have really advanced gunpowder weapons and just so many people in the army, they can really now go and kind of swallow up these parts of East Asia that up until this point were able to fight back against China, and in some cases threaten China. So now, the balance of power in East Asia has changed toward the Chinese heartland rather than the steppe nomads. So now, to some extent, though, they kind of governed with a light touch. So the Mongols, as long as they contributed troops to the Qing army, and as long as they paid tribute, they were allowed to kind of keep doing their thing. But it was a way of kind of subduing them and keeping them from really posing too big of a threat to China. So now, eventually then, as the flow of goods and international trade grows, the Qing dynasty, like other Chinese dynasties before them, starts to get a little worried about too much influence and control by foreigners. So they impose what became known as the Canton System on Europeans, who are the ones showing up in greater and greater numbers to export goods from China. The Canton System meant that European merchants were only allowed to go to one port in southern China, which Europeans called Canton, because they couldn't pronounce Guangzhou. And that would be the funnel through which all trade between China and Europeans would flow. And that meant that elsewhere in China, there wasn't a huge amount of European influence just yet. So there were some missionaries that would bounce around China, especially the Jesuits, Catholic missionaries from Spain and Portugal. But for the most part, contact between Chinese and Europeans was pretty minimal at this point. Now, over in Japan. So, a dynasty of daimyo called the Tokugawa clan, the Tokugawa family. So, they took power over Japan in the early 1600s. And for the first time in Japan, you've got a centralized government under a single group of leaders. So the Tokugawa dynasty, they took the title shogun, which basically meant military dictator of Japan. And their government then was called a shogunate. So this dynasty of military leaders ruled Japan for the next couple hundred years. But once again, they were samurai. They were warrior elites, but they claimed to rule on behalf of the emperor, that they were defending Japan and stabilizing it for the emperor himself. So once again, they claimed a kind of divine right. Now, they kind of did what the Chinese did, though. In order to limit foreign influence and what they perceived as a threat by Europeans, they instituted what was known as the Sakoku system, which limited trade with Europe to one port in the very south of Japan. And the one country... Yeah. Oh, that's the janitor, yeah. He likes jamming out while he's cleaning.
I mean, I get it.
So, I would just listen to podcasts or something if I had that job.
What did you say they have limited trade
With Europeans.
It's basically the same thing.
Yeah. Yes, kind of the same thing as the Canton System. And and in Japan then, the one European country that was allowed to trade with Japan under the Tokugawa dynasty was the Netherlands. So, any like new technologies or ideas that came to Japan flowed through the Netherlands. Now, the Netherlands at this point, for some context, over in Europe, were one of the countries that was the most dynamic and was involved in the most like scientific inquiry and technological development. So, the Tokugawa, they wanted to still know about stuff that was being developed and going on outside of Japan, but they wanted to have control over it. So all of like the knowledge that was brought to Japan by the Dutch eventually became known as Dutch studies by members of the elite in Japan. So now also then, so Japan was also one of the big silver producers of the world, along with the Spanish colonies. But unlike the Spanish, most of the silver that was produced in Japan, some of it went out to Europeans, some of it went to China because Chinese merchants were allowed to come to Japan as well. Most of the silver, though, stayed internal to the country. And because Japan was basically at peace, they didn't need to put a huge amount of money into military development. And you start to see that the silver does actually start like flowing through the Japanese economy. And merchants grow in power. People who produce consumer goods, and luxury goods start to grow in power. Peasants who become better at producing rice more efficiently also see their prospects rise. So for a couple of hundred years, Japan becomes a very sort of prosperous commercialized society, and outside of Europe, by the 1800s, we'll actually have the highest standard of living of any country in the world. So, good for them. Now, 1750 to 1900, Unit 5. A lot of things changing during this time period. So in China, the Qing dynasty starts a pretty steady decline in terms of like actual power and just in the prestige and the sort of authority that they have within China. And to some extent, like, their decline is really more about like public perception than about actual reality. So number one, this is when the British and other Europeans have industrialized. So, in the early 1800s, the British, they want the Qing dynasty to open up trade, to open up more ports to European trade. Because A, by this point, the British are producing industrial goods, so clothing and textiles and furniture and so on, that they want to sell in China. There's also one other good that they made in their colony in India that they wanted to sell in China. What was that?
They use cotton maybe to make shirts.
Well, cotton, but what was the drug that they were smuggling into China? Opium. Yeah.
But they went to the tea.
Yeah, they wanted to bring opium to China to sell it to Chinese people. And, for years they had been smuggling it in illegally against the wishes of the Qing dynasty. So, but they also wanted to buy more goods from China. They wanted to export more stuff from China as well, because there was always this growing demand for like Chinese silk and Chinese tea and Chinese porcelain. So they wanted to be able to buy more stuff as well as sell more stuff. So finally this came to a head in the early 1800s when the British Navy and the British East India Company sent in ships that were armed with the most up-to-date cannons and other technologies, and they just like destroy the Chinese Navy, and this was the Opium Wars. And as a result of this, China is forced open in a series of unequal treaties with Europeans, where they're basically forced to fling open the doors. And a bunch of new ports are opened to European trade, and the flow of goods back and forth increases. And even though, once again, this is like good for some Chinese people, the ones who are producing a lot and are selling a lot to European merchants. It's great for them. But it does have just this kind of destabilizing and disorienting effect, where many Chinese and the Qing dynasty just feel like things are getting a little out of control in China. Now, in response to that was the Taiping Rebellion, which was the bloodiest war in human history prior to World War II. So that's saying a lot. And this was a nationalist uprising in the south of China, where Chinese nationalists were worried about the Qing becoming too weak and foreigners having too much influence. So the Taiping were trying to drive out foreigners, drive out the Qing, and create a new, Chinese national state that would be based on Chinese rule for the Chinese. And the Taiping, they became somewhat popular because they were pledging to, uphold social justice and to distribute land to peasants and to allow equal rights for women. A very sort of modern way of thinking. So they were eventually put down, not necessarily by the Qing, but by foreign mercenaries, foreign soldiers. And the fact that the Qing couldn't really defend themselves further undermined their control and influence in the country. So now, eventually then, the rebellion's put down, but after that, the Qing dynasty tries to reinvigorate themselves. They try to start industrializing in a process known as self-strengthening. But this kind of falls flat, because by the time they try this in the late 1800s, the government is totally just run through with corruption, and warlords are starting to develop their own sort of separate independent territories, and all of the military technology that the Qing are importing into China falls into the hands of these independent warlords, and it just kind of falls flat. They're not able to catch up to the British, and they don't allow really economic freedom that would encourage industrialization. It's entirely government directed. And then finally, the last straw is the Boxer Rebellion, right around 1900. One more attempt by the Qing and some of their allies to drive out foreign influence. And the Boxers themselves, the guys who really sort of fought this rebellion, were actually Daoists, who sort of relied on that as the inspiration for their uprising. The Boxer Rebellion was just crushed by European forces. And this is it. This is now the moment when the Qing dynasty is basically forced to just give up any more claim to power in China. So, now in Japan, though, basically the opposite is happening. So there, the Sakoku system is broken when the United States arrives in 1853. So, Commodore Matthew Perry shows up in Japan with some big steamships with guns bristling everywhere. And basically he just forces the Japanese to open up their ports to trade. But in the aftermath of this, the Tokugawa dynasty abdicates. So the last shogun of Japan steps down because, he's considered now weak and he sort of gives up his authority. And in his place, a new government takes power based on the leadership of the emperor, Meiji. So for the first time in over 1,000 years, the emperor is stepping up and taking charge of the political system. Now, he has allies among the elites of Japan at this point, who now want to create a new sort of modern, forward-thinking government. And he becomes the sort of symbol of this new modern Japan that's about to take shape. So, they undertake a program of rapid, state-sponsored industrialization. So they knew what had happened to China with the Opium Wars. They saw these giant steamships. They saw the industrial goods that Americans and others began to import to Japan. So they start this process of industrialization for Japan to kind of catch up to the West in terms of productivity and technology. And at the same time, they go on this process of selective westernization. So they want to bring in things from the West that they look at as useful and beneficial. So they reform their education system with new science and math and technological education. They abolish the old class system So the samurai are no longer, restricted to just being government officials, and samurai who wanted to get into business were allowed to do so, and merchants were kind of freed, to get into more industries. And at the same time, there's this kind of big push to modernize styles of dress and the technology people used. The Japanese start playing baseball after it's introduced to them by the U.S. They bring in experts on technology and military affairs from Western countries. So German and American, soldiers will be brought in to consult and teach them just how to be a modern, powerful country. Now, this is also going to coincide with a new sort of form of nationalism in Japan. And the Japanese flag with the rising sun kind of symbolizes this rebirth of Japanese civilization that they're undertaking. And that also symbolizes the emperor himself, who's still viewed as the sort of sun, god, this kind of worshipful figure. So Shinto is re-emphasized. So Buddhism is kind of reduced in importance, and Shinto is re-emphasized as the thing that makes the Japanese Japanese, as the core of their national identity. The same way that the Spanish viewed Catholicism as the core of their national identity. And devotion to the emperor as a sort of religious duty also became a big element of Japanese nationalism. But then finally, as Japan modernized and industrialized, they also needed to kind of show their strength. So this new government under the Emperor Meiji begins to colonize Korea and then China. And this is meant to kind of represent this new balance of power, where the Japanese are rising and becoming the new sort of leaders of East Asian civilization. And others, like the Chinese, the Japanese elites started to kind of look down at the Chinese as backwards and kind of stuck in the past, while the Japanese were the fresh, hip, new leaders of East Asian civilization. So, finally then, Unit 6, 1900 of the present. Once again, a lot of stuff happening here. So China. By 1911, the Qing Dynasty is basically just a shell of its former self. And the last Qing emperor is finally overthrown. And in its place, you have new political leaders who declare China to be a republic that will be based on constitutional government and Western ideas about parliamentary government and representative government and just a sort of modern thing. But this very quickly collapses, though. And for a couple of decades, especially once the Japanese start to invade China, China collapses into basically a sort of civil war during the 20s and 30s called the Warlord Era. And in the context of this, the Communist Party emerges under the leadership of Mao Zedong. Mao, he becomes the leader of the communists in the 1920s, right as they're sort of beginning. And they kind of were inspired by the recent communist takeover of Russia that turned it into the Soviet Union. So in this moment of Chinese weakness and chaos, the communists emerge as this new force. And the communists, they fight against other Chinese forces, they fight against the Japanese, and then following World War II, the communists are able to claim victory over their rivals and establish control over all of mainland China. So, now once that happens, then under Mao Zedong, from 1949 to 76, when Mao's alive, China undergoes a totally radical transformation. So number one, kind of like Stalin in the Soviet Union, Mao created a command economy based on collectivization. All the land, all the resources, all the factories were under state control. And they decided what to produce, how much to produce, where it would be distributed. And this was designed to rapidly industrialize the country and also make it self-sufficient and, create a system where there was less hierarchical class difference And, under communist ideology, this was meant to make society equitable and fair and just for everybody. And this is also when women are kind of liberated in China for the first time and allowed to become more educated and start going into other careers. And now the thing is, though, there are some failures here. So the collectivization program, the Great Leap Forward, it does result in more industrialization, it results in rising literacy rates, but due to mismanagement, it also leads to millions of unnecessary deaths due to starvation and famine and crop failures and so on. And then, in the aftermath of this, Mao undertakes the Cultural Revolution, where he basically decides, you know what, the reason why the Great Leap Forward failed is because we're just not communist enough yet. So, he compiles a book called the Little Red Book. Well, eventually that's what it was called by Westerners, which becomes kind of like a Bible of Chinese communism. And in the Cultural Revolution, then, you have essentially mobs of youths who are recruited by Mao to basically go around China re-educating the people about proper communist ideology and just to sweep away anything old or traditional. So, Buddhist statues would be destroyed, Western musical instruments would be destroyed, and records and so on. Books would be burned if they didn't fit communist ideology. And for about a decade then, you see this kind of violent wave where Mao is trying to just purge China of anything that's considered non-communist. Now, eventually though, we're almost done. Eventually though, after Mao dies, the man who takes leadership of the Communist Party after him, Deng Xiaoping, he decides to completely transform China again. So he basically thinks, you know what, collectivization basically failed. The Cultural Revolution turned into this chaotic mess where, thousands of people were killed in mob violence, and it didn't really have the desired effect. So instead, he decided to kind of find a different path. So he started to allow more economic freedom. So he started to give land back to peasants, to give it back to private ownership. He allowed gradual privatization of some businesses and factories and so on. And gradually he allows capitalism to become a thing again in China. And under Deng then, this process begins of more economic freedom and economic growth as well. And this has happened pretty steadily since then as well. So China, for the past few decades, has been one of the fastest growing economies in the world as they've sort of gradually allowed more and more private enterprise to emerge. Now, however, though, he wanted to make sure that this didn't get out of control. So the Communist Party did stay pretty oppressive and very clearly did not allow any political opposition. So they're sort of claiming the same ideology that earlier Chinese dynasties did, that they're the ones who have the right to rule China because they're the ones who have the best interests of the people at heart, and that they're ruling on behalf of the people, and therefore they need to put down any opposition in order to maintain stability and order and growth. So, now elsewhere then, Japan. So their imperialist expansion continued in Korea, China, Southeast Asia, until 1945, when they were defeated by the United States in World War II. Basically every major city in Japan was annihilated during the course of the war, which, was capped by Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where we used the only 2 atomic bombs that have ever been used in war against Japan, to just convince them to finally surrender to the United States. So, following World War II, though, Japan did a very sort of rapid about-face. So after the war, Japan was occupied by the United States, and for several years received huge amounts of financial aid from the U.S. to help stabilize their economy, to rebuild their industries. They created a new constitution under the guidance of the United States that basically was a pacifist constitution. And the U.S., though, became one of the closest allies of Japan. So literally, like the second the war was over, we went in and started to rebuild the country and kind of like get them back on their feet. So they became one of the U.S.'s biggest trading partners, and within a couple of decades was one of the fastest growing economies and most dynamic and wealthiest countries in the entire world. And it still is to this day. In Korea, though, now big things happening in Korea. So until 1945, for the previous few decades, they had been colonized and occupied by Japan, and basically ruled as, as an occupied colony. But after World War II, though, once Korea is independent again, now you start to see a competition for power within Korea. So in the north of Korea, the Kim family, Kim Il-sung, this guy right here, became the leader of the Communist Party of Korea. And he was backed by China and Mao and the Soviet Union as well. He and his allies tried to take control over the entire Korean peninsula, but they were opposed by South Korean forces who were backed by the United States. And for a few years, there was an incredibly bloody war on the Korean peninsula that resulted in the division of Korea into two separate nations. North Korea in the north, also known as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which is still to this day ruled by the Kim family under a very, very strict and oppressive communist system. And, they're really like the last holdout to sort of like pure, command economy communism anywhere in the world. But in the South, though, the South, within a couple of decades, transitioned toward a democratic government and an adopted capitalist free market enterprise, but with state support, industrialized really fast, kind of like Japan in earlier decades under the Meiji era. And this is when some of the biggest companies in the world that are based in South Korea emerge. Companies like Samsung, which have very, very tight connections to the government of Korea and are providers of a huge amount of services for the government of Korea. So this kind of symbiotic relationship develops that allows these companies to grow, and for South Korea also to become one of the most advanced and developed and fastest growing countries in the world. So, yes?
Is that Tank Man?
Tank Man? Yeah, that's Tank Man. Stopping those tanks. But remember, though, this, we have no idea, actually.
Yeah, we don't.
Yeah.
He got pulled away.
Yeah. So Tank Man, though, once again, the Tiananmen Square event, this is one of the biggest pro-democracy protests in Chinese history, but it was put down by the Communist Party under Deng Xiaoping as like a show of force that the communists were going to continue ruling China. So, any other questions before I shut this thing down? All right.